Hello, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my June wrap-up. So in June I read 10 books and most of them were fantasy and horror, which makes sense because those are my favorite genres. And actually the first was not fantasy or horror, and it was Battle Royale, which is a dystopian thriller. And in this book, we are following a class of 42 kids, and they have been selected for this year's program. I think that's what it's called. And that basically means that they're gonna have to kill each other, and there can only be one survivor. And the people in charge say that this is necessary for their country's security or something, which obviously doesn't make any sense. But they are drugged and they are taken to a remote island where they do have to go through that. And actually, I have been wanting to read this book for so long, and I don't know like why it took me this long, but I finally got to it, and it was really good, but it was also really brutal, which I obviously expected, but I really loved the action scenes were amazing, but also the discussions about the politics and about the country they live in and all of that. And I also did like the main characters that we were following, but I wanted more of like one specific thing, because there was one thing that was talked about that was like one of the characters' goals, and that would have been really cool to see, but we didn't really get to explore that. And also I realized that I have more trust issues than I should have, because there was a character that I never trusted from like the beginning of the book to the end, and it turned out that they were trustworthy. So I guess I just have trust issues. But anyway, like I was saying, there was something that I would have liked to have seen explored a little more, especially because they kept talking about it. And I was getting to the end of the book and I was like, there is no way that this is gonna happen, because there was no time, and it didn't. But they were just like talking about it, and I would have liked to see it. But apart from that, it was a really good book and I really liked to read it, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I read Pen Pal, and this was a horror book, and this was another that I have been wanting to read for some time, but again, for some reason, hadn't yet. But in this one, we are following a unnamed character. We never learn his name. We just know that he's trying to figure out what has happened in his life, like how everything turned out, because we start following him when he is a kid. He's like, I don't know, maybe 4, 5-ish, not entirely sure, until he's an adult now, and he's trying to piece everything together. And this has like a bunch of, I think maybe 10-ish chapters, and they are all centered around a theme or like something that happened. They're not like in a linear timeline, because in some chapters he's an adult and then he's a kid again, and then he's an adult and then he's a teenager. So it just goes back and forth, and it's more about certain themes or certain occurrences that keep happening throughout his life. And basically this is called pen pal because when he was a kid, when he was in kindergarten, they had an activity where they had to find pen pals. And so they like wrote a letter and they tied it to a balloon, and it flew away, and then people were supposed to like find the balloon and write back. And most of the kids did get pen pals, some others never got any response. But our main character got actually like just some creepy photos. He never really got a letter. And then he realized that he was in all of the photos. And so instead of getting like a pen pal, he got a stalker. And the stalker kept like being present throughout his life. That was, he was trying to, figure out like what exactly has happened with everything, because he did a lot of crazy shit. And it was definitely unsettling, it was definitely creepy, and I was feeling very uncomfortable at times, which is exactly what I want from a horror book. So I really enjoyed this one, and I also gave this one 4 stars. Then I read Lone Women, which is another horror book, and in this one we were following Adelaide, and she, in the beginning of the book, is leaving her parents' house, and the house is burning, and her parents are inside, dead, and we don't know like how they died, or why they died, or literally anything that's happening. We don't really know like if she had anything to do with it, or if she was also attacked and she's trying to escape. We don't know anything. But we know that she's trying to move away to a place where no one knows her or her family. and she is bringing a locked trunk that has something that we know is dangerous inside, but we have no idea what it is. And we don't really get to learn what it is until like the 50-ish% mark, and that's really where the horror element is like revealed and where it starts, because up until that point I was like, what is the horror in this book other than like the real life horrors that she's experiencing, which are obviously bad but are just not what I like in my horror books. I always say this, like when the horror books are based on like real life horrors, like real life bad things that happen to people, that is really not what I like to read. And yeah, we got to that point, we learned like what the horror element was, and so I was like excited because that sounded really fun. But then the rest of the book also focused mostly on like real life horrible things that were happening to our main character and other characters around her, and only at the end did this supernatural horror thing come back. So it was not like what I expected it to be. So like I like the supernatural part, I like the main character, I liked, the book was okay. I didn't really like dislike any part of it, but it was also not what I wanted from it. So it was okay, and I gave it 3 stars. Then I read City of Heavenly Fire, and that is the 6th and last book in the Mortal Instruments series, so a fantasy book. And obviously I can't really get into the plot because this is the 6th and last in the series, but basically, I didn't really love any part of the series, but I definitely didn't love the last 3 books. Although I still think that this one was better than the 4th and the 5th, because at least in this one there were some parts that were like action-packed and that I was invested in the action, like I was actually, caring about what was happening. But still, there were so many like scenes that were, that felt unnecessary to me because I just didn't care. I was not invested. And so I was just bored throughout a big chunk of the book. And this book was so long. This book was insanely long, and I don't think it should have been. And so, yeah, it was okay. There were some parts I did enjoy, but mostly I was a little bored. So also gave this one 3 stars. Then I read another fantasy book, and that was Throne of Glass, which is the first book in the Throne of Glass series. And in this book, we are following Selena, and she used to be like a really badass assassin, but she has been in prison for a year. But in the beginning of the book, she is visited by the prince and the captain of the royal guard, and she learns that the king wants a champion to basically do his dirty work, and there's going to be a competition with a bunch of people who are competing to be the champion. And so the prince wants Selena to be like his champion in the competition, and so she is taken to the palace where she will be participating in the competition and training and all of that. And honestly, like, I was excited for that. That sounded so fun, but the competition was not as exciting and fun as I was expecting it to be. It was not, I wasn't like expecting, fights. That was not what we got. I was expecting something a little more brutal, a little more action, and that is not what we got. And also I was expecting the main character to be more badass and iconic, because everyone kept saying that Selena was the most badass, the most deadly assassin ever. And I'm just like, I believe that, but I want to see that. And I didn't really. And I do believe that I will see that in the next books in the series, but in this one, I didn't. And I definitely would have liked to have seen that. And also the romance, I hated it. And while I was reading, I didn't know if it was a me problem because I don't like romance, or if it was like the romance's problem. But then my friend who does really like romance read it, and she also hated the romance. So I feel validated. And yeah, definitely did not like that. What I did like was what we got to learn about the fantasy, because honestly, that was what I was here for. That's what I am reading this series for, is the fantasy. And obviously, like, the action with the fact that she's an assassin, but I didn't really get that part. I was not getting it. So I was mostly there for the fantasy. And yeah, I'm definitely really interested in learning more about that. And yeah, the book, again, was okay. I enjoyed it. It was a fun read, but it was nothing like amazing, incredible, mind-blowing. So I give it 3.5 stars. The next book I read was called Where Darkness Blooms, and this was a horror book, and we were following four girls, and they were all from the same small hometown, and all of their moms had gone missing. I think it was 2 years ago, something like that. And yeah, they had just gone missing. No one really knows what happened. Their bodies have never been found, so they don't even know if they're dead or if they're alive. And no one seems to care about what has happened to their mothers. No one seems to want to investigate. There's nothing happening. And so these four girls obviously decide that they need answers. They need to know what happened to their moms, and they start investigating. And for the longest time in this book, there was actually no horror other than, again, what they were experiencing in real life. And honestly, like the whole book, it was too much about just their lives and even romance, and that was not what I was here for. I also, like, even though it was so much focus, and even though there was so much focus on their lives and on like who they are, I never really connected to them enough to actually care. So I was just bored because, again, that's not what I was here for. And when we did get like the horror element, it was a little creepy. I mean, the only really creepy part was the prologue, which did get me excited, but then I was disappointed. But I mean, towards the end, there was a little more horror happening, but it was still not enough. And yeah, I mean, it was again okay. Like, I didn't hate it, I didn't despise this book, but I also didn't have fun, and I gave it 2.5 stars. Then I read Fourth Wing, which is the first book in the Empyrean series, and that's a fantasy series, and this book is so incredibly hyped, and so I had high expectations for it because like everyone loves this book, or almost everyone loves this book, and I mean, I was wanting to love it too, obviously, and so I decided to read this one. And I was like excited and had high expectations, but at the same time, being a fantasy romance, I was a little scared about the romance part. And I mean, spoiler alert, I didn't like the romance, but that was definitely not my only issue. And so we were following Violet, and she is entering the academy and the trials to become a dragon rider, even though she never really wanted to become one. She wanted to be a scribe like her dad was, but her mom is one of the generals of the dragon riders, so she makes Violet go try to become one as well. And so most of this book is like focused on the trials and like the challenges that they have to face, that they have to go through until they can become dragon riders. And I feel like that only works when you care about the characters, like just following them through trials, because that did work for me in a book I read this year that was The Rage of Dragons. It was mostly like also trials to get into an army, and it did work because I did really like the main character. But in this case, I didn't really care because it's not that I disliked Violet, but I also didn't like her that much. I didn't really care about her. Like, she was there, she existed, and that was okay. But also, you know, just following her without an actual plot and without that much action happening, I didn't really care, and I was kind of bored. And the only thing that was fun was when we got to meet the dragons and like learn about their bonds with their riders and like the magic that is behind that. That was actually really fun to learn about, but everything else was just like meh. It was okay. I didn't hate it, I didn't love it, except the romance that I did hate. And the end was fun. Actually, there was like action, there was a plot, there were things happening, and so I did have fun with the end. And especially like the very, very end was like a plot twist that everyone says is insane, and I get it. And I mean, again, like, it was an okay book. I didn't hate my time reading it, but I was also not having the most fun. And so I gave this one 3 stars. Then I read The Lake House, which was a horror book, and in this one we were following Claire and 2 other girls whose names I don't remember, but I mean, we were following Claire's POV all the time, and she has always had anxiety, and she has always like imagined the worst case scenarios in life, and that basically becomes true when she and those 2 other girls get to their summer camp, but they get there later than everyone else. And when they get there, the house where they were supposed to stay at has burned down. There's no sign of anyone alive. and they start like hearing movement and stuff, so they know that the killer is still there in the woods around the house where they were supposed to stay at. And so we are like following them as they try to survive. And this book was, like the previous horror book I talked about, was more focused on the characters and like their personal issues more than the plot and like what was happening. And I mean, I did like these characters more. I connected to them a little more. So I wasn't like as uninterested in them as I was in the other ones. And also like what was happening was more interesting as well, even if we weren't caring that much of it. I mean, most of the book, especially like the beginning, was more of a thriller than a horror. But then we got to the horror element, which like I saw coming, like what it was kind of, but it was still very cool. And I mean, I was like invested in their survival, but I was never really that excited. And once again, it was an okay book, and I gave it 3.5 stars. Then I read Yellowface, and this was a like contemporary literary fiction, which I don't typically read, but also it's a book from R.F. Kuang, and I have literally loved every book of hers that I've read, so obviously read this one. And in this book, we're following an author called Juniper, and she was friends sort of with another author, but an author that was actually like famous and, you know, best-selling author, unlike Juniper. And that other author was called Athena. And at the beginning of the book, Athena dies, and Juniper is with her when she dies, and they are at Athena's house. And so Juniper steals Athena's manuscript, and she tries to pass it as her own. And the book is about Chinese laborers in World War I. And Athena was, in fact, Chinese, and Juniper is not. She is white, but she like changes her author name to her middle name, which is Song. So people might think that she might be Chinese. And then the book is focusing on like all the drama that comes of her stealing the book. And I was so invested. And like Juniper is so delusional. She might be, I mean, she probably is the most delusional character I ever read about. Like, she was completely insane, but it was so entertaining to read from the point of view of someone who was, like I said, so delusional. And I was so invested in the drama, and I was like, I flew through this book and I was obsessed with it. There was just like a part towards the 70% mark that I was feeling like it was dragging a little bit. So like it wasn't completely perfect for me, but it was still so good, and I loved it. And I gave it 4.5 stars. And yeah, this book definitely saved my reading month for sure. And then the 10th and last book I read was called The Drift, and this was another horror book, and we were following 3 different POVs. So we were following Hannah, and she was sort of like escaping from her school with a bunch of other people, but they had an accident. And when they wake up, they're like trapped, and they don't really know how they can get out of there. And also they're kind of trapped with a virus, because in this world there is a virus that turns people into not zombies, but like kind of zombies. And so they need to try to survive that. And then we are following also Meg, and she wakes up in a cable car that is stopped with also a bunch of people in there, and they also need to figure that out. And then we are following Carter, and he is like working in a facility that is related in a way to like the infected people with that virus. And like honestly, we never really learn much about how this world works and what functions and what doesn't, and like how anything outside of those 3 characters and like that little area, like we don't learn anything besides that. So I don't really know like what the world really looks like. And also 2 of the POVs were so similar, and there were so many character names to keep track of that I was confused a lot of the time. And also I was never really invested in any of the 3 POVs that we were following. And I mean, the big reveal was kind of cool, but definitely not shocking. I was kind of expecting it already, but I mean, it was still cool. And the ending, like, it was okay. And again, like, it was an entertaining book. I didn't hate it, but I also didn't love it. And also gave this one 3 stars. So yeah, this was definitely not my most successful reading month. not in terms of like number of books read, and definitely not in terms of my enjoyment of the books, but I still read Yellowface, which I love, and Battle Royale and Pen Pal, which I also really, really enjoyed. So, I mean, there were some gems hidden in there, and there was like no book that I hated, but there were so many that were just like okay. That did they put me kind of in a slump? Yes. Am I currently in a slump? Yes. But we don't need to talk about that right now because that is about July and not June. So yeah, that is the end of this reading wrap up. And so thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you have enjoyed it. And if you did, give it a like and subscribe, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!